Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this special session from the Regional Science Policy and Practice. Let me very briefly introduce you the journal. Regional Science Policy and Practice is a journal from Regional Science Association International, and it's a very inclusive journal, publishing dozens of articles every year, and with a very active and professional editorial team. And they have asked me, as a former member of the editorial board, just to be introducing Professor Maria Abreu, who will be conducting this keynote speech. Maria Abreu, she's PhD in economics from the Free University of Amsterdam. And she's right now Professor of Economic Geography at the Department of Land Economy, of the University of Cambridge. She's author of papers in journals such as Regional Research Policy, Environmental Planning A, Journal of Economic Geography, and of course, papers in Regional Science and Annals of Regional Science. She's also co-editor of Spatial Economic Analysis and Regional Science Policy and Practice. She's member of the editorial board of several journals, including Annals of Regional Science, Papers of Regional Science, Letters in Spatial and Resource Sciences, and Journal of Regional Research. She is and has been involved in many activities of the Regional Sciences Association International, such as Councillor at Large at the Regional Science Association International, or member of the European Regional Science Association Council. Okay, today her talk, it's about capabilities, functionings, and a topic which is mainly or usually analyzed in development, international development, but she has moved that into the regional science dimension, and I think it will be of interest of a very large audience. Good morning, Maria. Thank you for being today with us, and the floor is yours.
Morning. Well, many thanks for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. It's a shame I can't see you all in person, but hopefully we'll see each other virtually in the chat or in the questions. So I will maybe share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So just to say before I start that I'm happy for people to type questions in the chat as I go along. If there's any questions for clarification, I'm happy also for Vicente to read them out, or otherwise we can talk more extensively at the end. So this talk, what I want to talk about is the capability approach, which is a philosophical approach within economics. It emerged with the work of Amartya Sen and also Martha Nussbaum. Amartya Sen, of course, was strongly linked to Cambridge, which is why there's a strong tradition in Cambridge of using this approach. And it's mainly used in international development, but I'm going to argue and try to convince you that it's a really useful option for thinking about regional development policy. So this is an attempt to develop a philosophy for regional development policy, essentially. The structure roughly of what I'm going to say is I'm going to give you an accessible, I hope, introduction to the capability approach. I'm happy to go into more detail in the questions if there's interest, and then focusing particularly on the things that I think are useful for regional development. And then I'm going to give you some, so that is mainly conceptual, and then I'm going to give you some examples and some ideas and tips of how this can be used in practice. I've presented some of this work to practitioners and policymakers, and there is quite a lot of interest, particularly in different levels of application. So we don't have to go the full capability approach, but we can use some insights to improve our development policies. I'll start with some background. The background, and as you'll see, I'll mention the paper at the end, is this comes from the UK's context, and the UK has at the moment many problems. A lot of them go back to its uneven regional structure. and regional development. And of course, that's also very strongly linked to what we've seen in the politics. So some of this work I started in 2016, and it was my attempt to understand why Brexit had happened, why people had voted for Brexit, and also in particular why some friends and family had voted for Brexit, and what the regional context was. So that is the background, and I want to talk just for a few minutes about the context, and then we'll go into the capability approach in detail. So we know, not just in the UK, but in many other European countries, that there is growing political discontent. Some of this is driven by the media and the social media, some of it by real economic underlying problems, some of it by cultural shifts and demographics. And this political discontent we observe particularly in declining and peripheral areas, not necessarily among the most disadvantaged people in these areas, but in general, in a contextual way, in these peripheral and declining areas where there's a feeling that they've been forgotten by policy. And then we observe the outcome of this in terms of a shift towards voting for populist parties, nationalist parties, and parties on the political extremes on both the left and the right. And we see this right across Europe and in the US and in other countries as well, Brazil, for example, with slightly different reasons in each country, of course. There's a big debate in the literature, which I know we're all familiar with, about whether this is due to economic shocks, globalization, immigration, the financial crisis, austerity or cuts in government budgets, or perhaps more cultural demographic shifts. Now, the interesting thing, and this is what started this particular project, in the UK, the Brexit referendum, if you followed it or if you unfortunately had to live through it, as I did, the slogan of the Leave campaign was "Take Back Control." And they used this in advertising that was directed at many different people. So there was take back control of, say, animal rights, take back control of agricultural policy, or of regional policy, all sorts of things. And this was a really clever slogan because it addressed the one thing that people were extremely aggrieved about, which was a feeling that they were not in charge of their local area. So they had lost control of decisions about their local area. And this lack of agency is one of the key things that I think we will need to address. So regional policy tends to be quite technocratic, and we think we're doing the right things to improve the economy of various places. And I have a feeling, or I feel at least in the UK it's true, and in other countries, that we lose sight of what the ultimate goal is that we're trying to achieve, and we lose sight of who should be in charge of making decisions. I want to show you these are two adverts that were shown on Facebook during the Brexit referendum. And a lot of these adverts were carefully targeted to people's particular interests, and also crucially to their location. So these two adverts have a regional focus. So they will have been shown to people in this case in Yorkshire, which is a region that has a very strong regional identity. And so the advert shows some flooding in a street in Yorkshire, and it says, do you want to send £350 million a week to the EU or build flood defences for Yorkshire? And then if you click on, you have to click on EU or Yorkshire. Of course, everybody clicks on Yorkshire, and then you send more advertising. The interesting thing is, of course, that it's geographically targeted to a particular grievance where people feel that the area is being flooded and they have no say on what money is coming to try to fix this problem. This is another one. It says it's about supporting the UK steel industry, but the UK steel industry is very geographically concentrated. So this will have been shown to people living in the areas where there's perhaps a perception that the steel plants will close and there'll be very high unemployment. Again, a feeling, targeting this feeling that they have no control over that shift. You can look at some more of these using this link, which I'm happy to share. The final bit of background I want to tell you about is, so following the Brexit referendum and all the other things that have happened, the UK government now has this levelling up policy programme, which is basically regional development with a different name. And as part of that, there's been a lot of research into what people want. And this Demos is a think tank, not politically aligned, so politically neutral think tank, and they look at topics to do with governance and democracy. And in this, they did a study, a very large survey and some focus groups, and they asked people what they want. And there are two interesting bits of findings here. The first one is that a very large proportion of people, their main priority was being involved in decisions about how government money was used in their local area. Of course, we have local governments that are elected by the people in the local area, but there's the feeling that they're not sufficiently responsive to local people, or that they don't have enough power. And then this is the most interesting bit. The preference for having a say is so strong that they're willing to have reduced funding as long as they have more control. So the agency control issue is really important. And I think that's where the capability approach can help. Okay, so I'll give you a short introduction to the capability approach. It's a very huge literature and many different scholars. Not all of them agree on some of the principles. We're going to follow mainly Amartya Sen's approach. I will mention some of the other schools, particularly Math and Nussbaum's, in some places where it's relevant. So the capability approach is a philosophical, ethical framework for thinking about human development, and the focus is on individual freedoms. The word freedom is used to mean opportunities, or having a choice. So a freedom is having been given the opportunity to choose whether you want to realize something or not. So you can think of freedoms as real opportunities. It's individualistic in the sense that it's focused on the outcomes for each person, but it is not individualistic in the sense that it thinks that only individual outcomes matter. Society and community and family matter because they affect individual freedoms or opportunities. I will come back to this. It was developed by Amartya Sen in the 1970s and onwards, and others, as an alternative to what was at the time a very strong focus in international development on GDP per capita and growth of GDP as a measure of economic development. And his argument was that this was not an indication of whether a country or so people were having better quality of life. So a focus on these sorts of resource type measures like GDP per capita is not enough to tell us if well-being is improving or not. The other thing about it is that it is quintessentially inclusive and broad. So I mentioned there's a criticism of GDP per capita and resources. It's also very strongly has criticized the subjective well-being happiness literature as being too narrow. However, both resources and happiness are part of the capability approach. They're just not everything. So the idea is that we need to have a broader view on what development is. It's widely used in international development, especially by the UN Development Programme, UNDP, not so much by the World Bank and other institutions. Okay, I'm going to give you an introduction with I'll start with the key elements. I'll start with some examples, then I will show you a diagram because sometimes visually it's a bit easier to follow. And then I will show you how we can broaden the approach to include some other elements. Okay, so I have two examples here. The three key components of the capability approach, the core ones, although they're not everything, are resources, capabilities, and functionings. And I've got two policy areas here that we might target in regional developments, transport and food and nutrition. Now, the resources are the things that we're used to targeting. So we're used to designing policies to improve people's access to resources. So, and again, we're thinking about this from an individual's point of view, not at the regional aggregate level for now. So the resources are things like income, car or bike ownership, we're thinking of transport here, and then skills, driving or cycling skills, human capital, and time. So these are the things that determine whether someone is able to transport themselves. Now, the capabilities, however, the argument is that resources are not the ultimate things of value. So if your policy is only targeting greater ownership of bikes, say, or better cycling skills, or higher income so people can afford petrol or bikes, that isn't enough to decide whether the policy is successful or is improving people's quality of life. The things that matter to people, the things that matter when you ask them, are things like having the ability to travel to work, having the ability to meet friends and family, having the ability to visit shops and services, or perhaps just cycling or driving for its own sake, the ability to enjoy scenic landscapes. And these are all opportunities of freedom. So you may have the ability to travel to work, but choose not to, and choose to work from home. The important thing is that you have the opportunity, and then you have the agency to make the choice. So if you decide to exercise the choice and realize the capability, you end up with functionings. These are the things that we observe in practice. So commuting to work, meeting friends, shopping for essentials, enjoying scenic landscapes. These are the things we could probably measure using surveys and so on, and administrative data. Of course, the capabilities can also be measured, but you have to ask people what they are. The other example here is food and nutrition. This is a really important issue in the UK at the moment because for a number of complicated reasons, we have very high poverty levels, including very high levels of numbers of people who can't afford to buy and eat enough to be nourished, including people in work. So some of the resources that the government might target to improve that situation are things like income, access to grocery stores, because there are areas where there are food deserts and you can't buy any healthy food. Some people don't have capacity to store food in their home, so that limits how much healthy, cheap food they can buy. Cooking skills, some people may not know what to do with fresh food, and access to kitchen appliances. Some people may only have a microwave and therefore they can't cook quality meals. However, these are all important, of course, but the things that really matter in the end to people and that we're trying to achieve are things like having the ability to be well nourished, having the ability to enjoy food with others, and having the ability to provide healthy food for your family. And so I think because the government doesn't focus on this, they think perhaps giving people some basic food is enough. They're not thinking that perhaps people want to be able to provide food for their family, and it's not enough just to give them some very basic food that doesn't have a lot of nutritional value. The things that we observe are things like whether someone is well nourished, whether someone enjoys a meal with friends, whether someone is able to provide good quality meals for their children. The shift from resources to capabilities is constrained also by people's ability to convert these into valuable capabilities. For example, if you have a local residents who are elderly or disabled or for some other reason are not able to translate these resources into capabilities, for example, they may have arthritis so they can't cook as well, then providing the resources and ignoring whether they're turning into the capabilities and functionings means that you're not targeting the things that actually matter to people and not achieving higher quality of life for everyone. Okay, so I want to talk about two other building blocks, and then I'll show you the diagram. First, the principle of each person as an end. This is a core principle, as I mentioned. It's the capability approach is based on individuals, but not in sort of libertarian kind of way, but in the sense that each person matters. So this is sometimes known as normative individualism in the literature, although there's some debate. So it argues that individuals are the units of ultimate moral concern, and each person counts as a moral equal when it comes to policy. And then crucially, this means that we are interested in the outcomes for each person and not in the regional average or the aggregate outcome. So say the median nutritional level of nourishment in the region is improving. However, we're still interested in the tails of the distribution and why some people might not be turning whatever the policy is providing into better nourishment. This requires us to consider, the first thing is, as I mentioned earlier, what is the ultimate aim that we're trying to achieve? Not the resources, not even the number of trips that people take and so on, but what is it that we're ultimately trying to change, and that should drive our policy. And then finally, as I mentioned, there are factors that could prevent some individuals from turning the resources into capabilities, and we need to identify those factors, called conversion factors, in order to make our policy as effective as possible. And often, I think, not always, but sometimes or often, at least in the case of the UK, we forget about conversion factors and about details of the distribution. Okay, just to mention conversion factors again, these are things that affect the ability of individuals to turn resources into capabilities and functionings. This could be due to their gender or their age or their disability, their ethnicity, their lack of skills, and so on, their social class. So I've got two examples here from regional policy. The first one, suppose the government funds a regional training center for young people so they can acquire new vocational skills. However, they put it in a place that is cheap, but doesn't have, it's very hard to reach by public transport. For example, you need to take 2 or 3 modes of transport to get there. This means that we're introducing an obstacle to people who perhaps don't have a car or can't drive for various reasons, and therefore we're not reaching every single person. We are, by design, limiting who can access it. I mean, this sounds like a very stupid thing to do, but this happened in my own region, and in the end, the centre had to close because a lot of people couldn't reach it. Another example, suppose the national government increases funding for schools, but in some areas there's quite a few students who lack a quiet place to study or school supplies because of their home environment. Again, if we believe in that every person matters, we have moral individualism, we believe that we should try to reach these people, and we should try to put in place additional policies to try to improve their access. And doing the first thing is not enough. Okay, so this is a diagram summarizing what I've just said, with some additions. So first of all, we have structural factors. This is the national and regional context in which policy operates. So we have institutions and laws, we have social norms, we have the built and the natural environment, infrastructure, and we have the media and social media. A lot of policies are directed towards changing structural factors. For example, you could introduce new regulations, you could build new schools and roads and so on. And these are done at the regional or national level. Then the structural factors, as I mentioned earlier, they create the intermediate environment that makes development possible. So they create what the capability approach calls instrumental freedoms or opportunities. These are intermediate goals. So, and there are things like political freedoms, economic facilities or opportunities, social opportunities for social mobility, for example. Transparency guarantees have to do with fairness in the process. Protective security has to do with property rights, and in some countries, of course, personal protection from crime, for example. And these enable people, together with their personal characteristics, to have resources. So a certain income, which is enabled by the labour market and the political freedoms and so on. Human capital, social capital, I've added non-market production, and time, because perhaps better infrastructure means you can get home more quickly. These resources in turn turn into consumption, so you can use your income and your human capital to buy food, to acquire education, and so on. However, as I said, the conversion factors determine whether you can turn these into capabilities. So you might be buying food with your income. However, because you have a physical disability or a lack of a skill, you can't turn these into nutrition. Or you have been to school, you have received an education. However, because of your home environment, you haven't been able to turn this into opportunities for having a good job. And then we have the functionings here that we observe realized from the capabilities. Okay. So those are the basic building blocks. However, I mentioned earlier that the capability approach is quintessentially broad, and it includes other aspects that matter for well-being. The first one is agency. So I mentioned agency is really important because of feeling that people have that they have no control. Agency is what allows you, what gives you the choice. I've got an example here. So this example is adapted by an example from Maria Sen in a book he published in 2009. So we have a young person here, and she's deciding, she's finished high school, she's deciding whether to study music or I think this is biology. She looks at all the options, she thinks about her career and her well-being and the things she enjoys and what she wants to do with her life. And she decides that she wants to study music. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is we now have some authoritarian guardians of society. This is a Amartya Sen's term. So we have these authoritarian guardians of society, and they tell her that it's not appropriate for her to study music, and instead she has to study biology. Now, there are two problems with that scenario. The first one is she's now doing something that is not conducive or not the optimal thing for her well-being and career prospects and so on. And the second thing is she's had the choice removed. So she's now no longer in control of deciding whether to study music or biology. Of course, this is something that actually happens in a lot of countries. There's a limited choice of what certain people are allowed to study. Now, that's the second scenario. To see why splitting the problem into two parts is useful, we can consider a third scenario where instead of the authoritarian guardians of society are in charge, but they tell her she must study biology. Now, in this case, she is being forced to study the thing that she would have chosen anyway. So the first problem to do with her capabilities arising from the subject choice are now fixed. However, she doesn't have the choice. And losing the choice has a big impact on her well-being. She's no longer able to choose for herself. And that's why separating the two is really useful. And that's why also why agency is so important in determining human development outcomes. So Amartya Sen makes a very big point about agency, and agency is a sort of a separate freedom that we add to the capabilities in terms of determining whether someone has quality of life. The other bits that goes beyond the core concepts is process. So in addition to agency, how things are decided also matters at the sort of national, regional level. And basically the process that determines whether you have the capabilities or the agency, whether it's more or less democratic, fair and transparent. So this is important separately from the other two. And the reason why process is a separate important thing is because it affects how people view the outcomes. So in the authoritarian guardians of society case, this young lady has lost the choice of what to study, but she also resents the process that put these people in charge and making her do what she doesn't want to do, or what she does want to do, but without choice. And if the process is seen as unfair or undemocratic, this feeds back into whether people support the institutions, the social norms, etc., the structural factors at the beginning. So, for example, if you were trying to promote, say, mobility rights to support people's mobility capabilities, so building access routes to buildings, improving public transport to allow people with mobility constraints to move, and so on. If you want to build support for that, you have to make sure the process is seen as fair and transparent, and over time, this will lead to greater support of the institutions and the laws and the regulations that support the whole system. I just also want to mention, sorry, going back to this, one of the interesting things about the Brexit vote in the UK was that places that had a lot of EU investment actually had very high levels of pro-Brexit vote. And it was interesting because sometimes the people were living in communities that had received, say, sports facilities or business parks or a lot of EU physical infrastructure with big EU signs on it. And people couldn't understand why there was so much anti-EU feeling in places that had received so much from the EU. And the reason is that people resented the EU because they had had no say over what the money had been spent on. So, and we discussed this I discussed this in another paper. So we realized that people saw the EU sign on the building and they resented it because they had had no input into what the money went from, and they felt there were other needs. So that's why the process is so important. Okay, so this is the same diagram. I've just taken out the extra words, and I want to show you where these extra bits come in. So we have capabilities, we have agency freedom. Some people consider agency a capability, or you can think of it as a meta capability, which determines the fact that you have choice. And then finally, process freedom. And all of these together are known as comprehensive outcomes in the Amartya Sen literature. As I said earlier, the structural factors affect regulations, institutions, social norm, the media, affect how the process, how much process freedom there is, how transparent and fair the process is, and then you get feedback to the structural factors. So the process affects people's values and choices, and that in turn leads to support or not for structural factors. I haven't mentioned human rights and social justice, but that can be incorporated. A lot of people work on this in the capability approach, and you can think of human rights as the right to have certain capability sets and certain types of agency. Okay, so that's my introduction to the capability set. I don't know if there are any questions. I can't see, but if there are, please Vicente, let me know. But so I can move. Okay, I can move into the policy side. Okay, what are the key challenges as I see them for regional policy? The first one is objectives. So how do we identify objectives, and how do we reconcile objectives that are aimed towards growth with those that are aimed towards quality of life? And so building transport infrastructure, say, versus improving how the town center looks, for example. Agency, how do we involve the local community and encourage ownership of the outcomes in a way that makes them support the process? How do we choose the locations to prioritize, and how do we evaluate success? And finally, who should deliver the policy and how should the policy be delivered? These are all the issues that the UK's in particular is struggling with at the moment, because we have lost the EU funding, regional funds, and we're trying to replace them with something else. Okay, so how does the capability approach come into it? The first obvious aspect is that with the structural factors. So the structural factors and the intermediate freedoms affect the extent to which an individual can achieve different capability sets in different locations. So one region may have better institutions and infrastructure and social norms and so on than another region. And because we are focused on individuals, we have to think about it in the sense that an individual can move from one region to another and achieve better opportunities. Of course, whether the person also achieves better outcomes or functionings depends on what they choose to do with their opportunities. So these are some of the factors I just mentioned. And in order to improve capability sets, we need to we can improve these intermediate aspects in order to improve resources, and eventually that will lead or should lead into capabilities. So an individual can potentially improve their capability set by moving to a different location with better structural factors. However, regional policy can also affect other aspects of the framework. For example, It could look at conversion factors, why some individuals can't turn those resources into capabilities. It can look at agency and why some people may be constrained in making a choice. And it can look at the process, is it more or less democratic or fair? Okay, so this is the way I think about it is, or this comes from talking to many policymakers. We don't have to use the full capability approach straight away. We can improve regional development policy by just thinking about it in theoretical terms and using it to inform our policy decisions. So that's what I call the light approach. So this can work together with theories of change, improving how we think about regional development. Medium, which is where we use it as a tool for choosing specific policies based on what local people think or believe are the valuable opportunities that they want money invested in. And finally, full, this is where I think we can use it also for measurement and evaluation. For medium and full, we need some form of democratic participation or participatory democracy, such as, say, participatory budgeting, or there are other options which we discuss in the paper. And that's because we don't know what people's valuable capabilities are, and this may vary from place to place. There are some strands of the capability approach that believe in having a list of central capabilities that is decided by experts together with a cross-section of the population. Amartya Sen is very much of the view that each person should be able to identify what their particular important valuable capabilities are, and I lean towards that view. Okay, I have two examples in the paper. We have many more. So one is from the UK and one is from Canada. This example is
hello, Maria. There is a couple of questions before you move to the example, if you want.
Sure.
Okay. Artem Korzenevich asks, I have a couple of questions. If you could reiterate why in the general framework you have an arrow from consumption to capabilities and not the other way around, not vice versa. Okay.
Yeah.
What is meant by consumption there? And also he's or she's asking, and how is environmental dimension entering in this framework?
Okay, yeah, great. So the consumption question is a really good one. It's used in a slightly different way to how we would normally use consumption. So it is basically using your resources to acquire some goods, some things. So for example, acquiring food and eating it would be consumption, but that does not necessarily mean that the food turns into nutrition, because that depends on your body weight and your health and some other things. So consumption is basically just having material things that you use your resources to buy, essentially. Why is there no feedback? I suppose eventually there is a feedback because a person who's better nourished, that in turn affects their resources and therefore their consumption. That's a good point, yeah.
And the environment, what about the environment?
The environment, the environmental dimension comes into the structural factors, I think. So the environment of the place where you live. And also it could affect your capabilities. Perhaps if you value the environment more, then that's a more valuable capability.
Okay, and we also have a question from Evelyn van Leuven. She congratulates you for your talk. And she also asks if you could elaborate a bit more on the interaction between, for example, conversion factors and the spatial environment, in particular neighborhoods. And she says, we know people influence space and space people. People impact neighborhoods in the terms of safety, inclusiveness, ambitions, and vice versa. Thank you.
Yeah, so the conversion factors are affected by the structural factors and individual characteristics. So things like the neighborhood characteristics feed into the conversion factors. So if you live in a neighborhood that has, I don't know, very low social capital, and you come from a disadvantaged group, then perhaps that restricts even more the link between consumption and capabilities. So the neighborhood is a structural factor because it's not an individual factor, but it feeds into the conversion factors and of course also into resources via intermediate freedoms.
Great, thank you, Maria.
Okay, good questions. Thank you. Okay, I'll just move on. Okay, so I have two examples here. I've picked them because one is more about the using it as a theoretical framework, and the other one is more about a full using it in full in all aspects of the policy. I should mention there's another really good example of a theoretical framework, which is the wealth and poverty reports that the German government produce every 4 to 5 years, which we discuss in the paper. So this one is the UK has an Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is an independent body that monitors progress on equality and human rights, particularly for minority and vulnerable groups. And in 2008-9, they decided to come up with a better way of measuring progress, and they decided to use the capability approach to do this. So they commissioned some experts to develop a theoretical framework that they could use for measurement. And the framework has some of the components I've mentioned. It has functionings. So these are realized states of being and doing, realized capabilities, for example, health status. So whether people in a particular group have certain health outcomes. The second component is measures of autonomy. So this is related to agency, whether people feel empowered in the health case, for example, when they go to hospital, do they feel that they are listened to and they have a choice? The extent to which people have choices and the extent to which people feel they have control. And then finally, there's a component which is treatment. And this is things like immunity from arbitrary interference, so whether you can make decisions without someone else trying to interfere, lack of discrimination, and so on. So this is related to process, although perhaps a little bit also to agency. And then they found measures for each of these components for each of a set of areas that people had identified as being valuable. So they use the approach of having central capabilities, which is less of a Amartya Sen perspective, more of a Martha Nussbaum, which is the other big school within the capability approach. And the idea is that you identify by talking to experts and by democratic deliberation, so asking people in focus groups or bigger groups, what are the things that are valuable in their lives, and then coming up with ways of operationalizing that in policy. The expert views were academics, people who work at some charities, and they also, I thought this was interesting, they went through international treaties identifying the things that were protected, and then they concluded that those things must have been important. And so these are the things that they identified: the central capabilities: life, health, physical security, legal security, education and learning, standard of living, productive and valued, being able to engage in productive and valued activities, individual, family and social life, identity expression and self-respect, and participation, influence and voice. And for each of these, they then found indicators to measure the functionings, the agency and the process. So this is for the health domain, just to give you an example. These are some of the sets of indicators they found, measures of whether people had a limiting illness, disability or mental health condition. Also their subjective evaluation of their health status. I haven't mentioned happiness, but happiness, you could think of it as a capability. So the ability to be happy is a very important capability. So that's why they have the subjective component. Dignity and respect in health treatment related to process. And then a couple of others: healthy living and vulnerability to accidents. And for each of these, they also had measures of agency for each one. Okay, that's the first example. The second example is a community program in the town of Whistler, the skiing resort of Whistler in Canada. The program is called ERSA2022. You can go to the website. I've got I have a screenshot in a minute. It finished in 2020, so it was developed in, I think, 2015. And they now have a follow-up, but the original one is interesting because of how they set it up. So the town of Whistler is a famous skiing resort in Canada. They also have other activities, in this case, mountain biking in the summer. They have pressures from climate change and large numbers of tourists, a very small permanent population that is affected by tourism because they are priced out of the housing markets. There's pollution, other pressures on the environment, and so on, seasonal work. So the classic tourist town problem. So this is what they did. This is the website, the Whistler 2020 website. It tells you there's a story here of how they developed it, which is really interesting. So what they did is they got together all of the major stakeholders in the community, business, education, the police, health, and groups of citizens, and all the local charities as well, and housing developers. And they together agreed on a list of priorities. So these are the sort of the capabilities or the things that are considered most valuable by local people and with support from the local stakeholders. Those are the priorities. And then finally, they came up with a strategy to improve and achieve each of those priorities. And then the crucial bit, which is why I think it's interesting, they came up with measures to measure success on each of the priorities and the strategies. And this is all publicly available, transparent. The local residents came up with the measures. They decided to spend money collecting new data, and they monitor constantly progress. And you can see it all on the website. So these are the main priorities here: enriching community life, enhancing the resort experience, protecting the environment, ensuring economic viability, and partnering for success, which is a community stakeholder thing. And for each of these, there are some indicators. These are the community ones here, the different sub priorities. They use a traffic light system to show whether things are improving or not. And this is just an example of one of the indicators. In this case, it's crime. So it tells you why they monitor it, what it measures, and then you get two sets of measures here, the raw incidence and, sorry, in orange, and the incidence per 1,000 residents. And you can see that crime is falling, it's going in the right direction. That's why the traffic light system is green. And these are monitored by a group of residents who also came up with the indicator. So the residents are involved in the evaluation and in the decisions about what to do next. They don't use the capability approach as a framework, but they use a lot of the same principles. Okay, unfortunately, I don't have time to give you more examples, but there are quite a few in the paper if you're interested. So to summarize, what are the principles of a capability-inspired regional policy? The first one is, I think, really important, and we sometimes don't fail to do this often. A focus on the ultimate goals that people have reason to value, rather than in the intermediate goals. So often policy announcements say things like, we're going to improve productivity, we're going to build a new road, we're going to have more schools, more teachers, but it doesn't articulate what the ultimate thing is that is achieving. So we're going to have a road so people have better access to shops and services. We're going to improve the schools so people have more choice in what they can do with their careers and their lives, that kind of thing. What is the ultimate thing we're trying to achieve is often missing. The second thing is a move away from talking about regional averages and an understanding of the conversion factors. So what is it that's preventing some groups of people from making use of these resources and turning them into valuable opportunities? The third thing is an effective role for local residents in all aspects of the program. So the design, the implementation, and also the evaluation, and often the evaluation bit is missing, almost always. So there's no understanding by the local community of what was achieved or wasn't achieved and why, which in turn affects support for the program. And then in turn, fairness and transparency in the entire process, including in the evaluation process, as the Whistler 2020 people do. So it's all on the website, there's no hidden outcomes and so on. And then informational pluralism, so that we evaluate the outcomes from different perspectives, the subjective well-being, the resources, but also the opportunities and the functionings and the agency, so that we don't just focus on resources and sometimes subjective well-being. And I think this is the paper, if you're interested, you can find it on SOC Archive and download it. And I think that's all I have. I'll stop there.
And that's not for you, Maria. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. And I see that there are some few questions in the pipeline. Let's look. Okay, we have questions from David Castells Quintana. And he says, I don't know if you can see the question. I guess you do. Let me read it in loudly. Thinking about the capabilities approach centered around the individual, two things come to my mind. One, capabilities as ends, but also as tools for development, instrumental versus intrinsic freedoms. And two, the key role of reducing inequality, especially for opportunities. I would appreciate to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So capabilities, I think, at least from my perspective, they're a tool that guides our policy decisions. So we can't really measure capabilities directly, or it's quite hard, but we can keep them in mind when designing intermediate policies. So we are investing in instrumental freedoms, the intermediate freedoms, in order to create these opportunities. And then the second point, I think is really interesting, because the capability approach has a focus on individuals and on individual freedom. The focus is on making opportunities available, and of course we can't force people to take them. But the opportunities have to be real ones. They can't just be, okay, we've improved the schools. If you didn't do well, it's your own fault. We need to understand whether there are reasons preventing people from realizing the opportunities. So I see it as a tool for reducing inequality. Of course, you can't force people to take advantage of opportunities, but you can try to understand if there are bottlenecks that stop them from doing that.
Okay, and there is also a comment from Professor Vasilis Monasteriotis, and he says, he's a very long paragraph. Let me see if I can read it quite quickly. Maria, in your description of the capabilities approach, you have emphasized a lot of choice and agency. The emphasis on choice sounds quite similar to the choice agenda under Tony Blair's third way, but choice can be problematic in at least two ways. First, relating to information, see the support for Brexit, Trump, Orban, etc. If people do not have full information or the ability to process it, they may end up advocating for the wrong policies. I know this sounds elitist, but ultimately it is a question of people's choice versus objective. Expertise link also to the issue of nanny state. Second, in relation to the social spillovers, say, some better off people exercise their agency to promote an exclusionary policy in a way that reduces the capabilities of others. Think of free schools in the UK context, which had detrimental effects on the local comprehensive schools. Do we still want to empower choice and agency, even if we know that this gives more say to those better off? And then he finally summarizes this in two questions. A, what if choice is by uniform people? B, what if choice empowers disproportionately those already empowered? And let me add to this, to Vasilis' questions by just two of the questions of the, I don't know if you heard of this Susanna Zuboff book on surveillance capitalism. She talks about, she has three questions. Two of them are who decides and who decides who decides. Okay, and this is a key issue. Okay, so what is, because you started your and this is not from my Vasilis, this is from me. sorry Vasilis. I think you start with your paper with just signaling this Brexit process, and people want to take back control, etc. But my feeling is that many times I don't know if everyone is actually taking the word in the debate, okay, and not even if they want to debate or just willing to go in the debate. They only want to demonstrate and show their discontent, okay, but they are not, I'm not sure if they're willing just to participate in the debate. So what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So so basically these are the key problems. We do talk about them in the paper, although we're writing a follow-up paper on democratic participation and how that can be used. So I'll start with Vasilis, which is the issue of basically these issues are really big in the literature on the capability approach. The first one of information, and something known as adaptive preferences, which means that people adapt to the environment in which they're in. So this first issue is they may not have the information about the details of the policy to make an informed choice. And the second thing is people who live in very disadvantaged conditions adapt to the environment in which they live, and they may not perceive that they have the disadvantage in a sufficiently strong way. So so Amartya Sen is, when we talk about choice, it has to be informed choice. And wherever the capability approach has been operationalized, it has been through some democratic deliberation, which is informed by experts on the options. And there are ways of doing this, but it seems to work well. So there's a big literature on participatory budgeting, which is where part of the regional budget is given over to local residents to decide what to do with it. And in general, people make the right choices, and actually spending on things like health and education tends to go up when people are given the choice, rather than spending on things like roads and vanity projects. So it can work with some expert information in order to inform the decision. There are complaints that the capability approach is very paternalistic in that sense. However, I agree, the issue of informed choice is really important. The second one is the issue of elite capture. And this is a bigger problem because if you have these focus groups or the deliberative structures, the people who have the time and the skills to be involved in them tend to be not the most disadvantaged. So some of these programs will have quotas for different minority groups and processes to try to make sure that there is full representation. So there are big problems, but there are ways of addressing them that have been tried. And then the issue of surveillance, the issue of what if we give if we empower these groups that try to subvert the whole system. Of course, that is also a problem, and we just need strong institutions and strong public support for the institutions to prevent that. I think that's where I think the UK went wrong with Brexit.
Thank you, Maria. Let's continue with a question again from Artem Korzenevich. Does this approach ultimately mean a focus on minimum for all people levels of some indicators like income or health rather than average values? Because it cannot be the same level for all.
Yeah, good question. So there are two different schools of thought within the capability approach. One of them, which is the Martha Nussbaum school of thought, believes very strongly there should be a list of key capabilities that everybody should have access to. And there are different lists. So she has a list in her book. And then there should be minimum standards that everybody should have for each of those central capabilities. And you can encode those in law, and you can call them human rights, and access to them you can call social justice. So that's one way of doing it. I suppose that gets around the issue of asking people what they value and getting the wrong answer, perhaps, if people are adapted to their environment or not well informed. So I guess what I'm saying is a combination of both. You can use the minimum indicators to make sure nobody's falling below a certain level and we don't miss anyone. We also need to make sure we are checking for why some individual groups or individuals are not able to make use of the whatever resources we're providing.
Okay.
So there's a different schools of thought, but I guess I'm in favor of minimum plus some choice.
I see. Lisbeth the shooter comments, CA capability approach, I guess, in regional context generally needs to address inequalities among others. How does your framework prevent the best outcomes that benefit the majority group powerful stakeholders, rather than addressing the needs and capabilities of minorities, people with less capabilities? For example, have these groups been part of the process in the Whistler example?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So it's related to the issue of elite capture. So how do you make sure that the most disadvantaged are involved in the process? And the Whistler 2020 example, perhaps they included all the stakeholders because they had to come up with the strategies at the same time as deciding the priorities. So perhaps it's not the best example. In other examples, in the I mentioned the Equality and Human Rights Framework and also the German Wealth and Poverty reports, they had assemblies involving the groups that were most disadvantaged. So in the German case, it's basically a publication that looks at indicators and they look at both wealth and poverty, which is really interesting. So wealth being an abundance of capabilities and poverty being a lack of capabilities. And you have to see both because you have to understand how the wealthy got to have that wealth in order to explain why also part of the reason why the poor don't have it. So, and they did have assemblies of low-income people and other disadvantaged people to try to understand what the barriers were, what the things that they considered most valuable were. It's very hard to do because disadvantaged groups tend to be marginalized and not involved in the community, and so it's very difficult to reach them. So I guess that's a very long answer, but it is important and we have to try to do it, but I think it's very hard to do it perfectly.
Okay, as we wait for further questions in the chat, let me pose you another one, which is about the spatial scale. Okay, is there any optimal spatial scale for this approach? I guess that education has a different scale than health, or a different scale than transportation. But as far as it is involved with people participation, etc., and direct people participation, I think a more local scale is very likely to be more connected with this approach. But is that at the neighborhood level, at the city level, at the metropolitan level? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, really good question. So I think it can be done at different scales. I'll give you an example. The state of Porto Alegre in Brazil, they have a participatory budgeting system. And it works, it started at a community level, but it works. So decisions are made by communities on what they need the most. Fixing a water pipe or a bridge, or very small amounts. And then those decisions are listed and sent to like a citywide or a bigger group, who then consider them together with all the other needs at that level. And then there's a state level where they consider big priorities. So how much do we spend on health, and how much do we spend on transport, and so on. And then the decisions filter down, and local people, the priorities are ranked so that these decisions are filtered up, and then the other decisions are filtered down. So you could do it in a sort of multi-level framework. But I think they're most effective at a local level. And there is a role for meso and national, larger regional policies and national policies to enable growth and productivity and so on. But then the local level governments monitor whether that has an impact on people's quality of life. I guess that's how I see it. Nobody's tried to do this at all levels. Porto Alegre is the only example where they've tried a multi-level approach. Although I
Thank
think
you.
in India as well, there are Indian states that apply the capability approach at different levels.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, more questions? Any more questions from the audience? Well, I think you already showed that the paper is available online, is it?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think it's a great opportunity for all to read the paper. I already did. I really enjoyed it. And even if it comes with many questions that we have seen here, I think this is very inspiring because we need theoretical frameworks just to think on how the regional policy, local policy has to be. And I can think on the actual regional policies that we have in Europe or that are being designed in the UK at the light of this approach. And I don't know if there is, let's say, a rank or a 0-10 scale in which you can say actual policies are quite close or quite far away from this approach, because they have not, in my view, this theoretical framework in the mind, but you can link many of them, as you said. This is not the theoretical basis, but they are applying many of these principles in the Whistler example. So how close do you think they are?
I mean, I think most of them fail on the agency side, and in particular on involving people in, well, first of all, asking people what they want. Of course, people have local elected representatives, but those don't always speak for all parts of the community, especially if they're elected using majority voting as they are in the UK. I think, well, in the UK, we're very far, but there are many other problems in the UK. I think there was an attempt in Europe to move towards using indicators that are closer to outcomes than to outputs. So not the number of miles of road or the number of journeys or and so on, but looking at travel times and things that are a bit closer to what people value. But I think we are very far away. I think even thinking about it theoretically is an improvement, because at least then it highlights the things that are missing. And I hope over time will improve policy design. At least whenever I've presented it to policymakers, they were very interested, and they have used some of the ideas, at least in their theories of change, just to show what it is ultimately we're trying to achieve. But I mean, I think it's very close to not being used at all. It is in other countries because of the UN promotes it very heavily in development. So in India and in parts of Africa, in fact, there are a few examples in Spain, I think, of participatory budgeting, small examples as well.
Okay.
But yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Big clap to Maria. And there is a request from Evelyn van Leuven. If you could share the link to the paper here, it would be great for everyone just to have access to it. In any case, let me remember about the title. You can Google that. A capability approach perspective on leveling up. Okay. And this is signed by Maria Abreu, Flavio Comin, and Calvin Jones. Okay.
Okay, I have the link. Yeah.
And I want to finish thanking again to Regional Science Policy and Practice, who is just the actual sponsor of this session. And of course to ERSA for inviting us, and for all the attendants, and most of and of course mostly to Maria for his excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.